Hello there and welcome to the Drex Files Radio Hour. Drexler Reads Across the Metaverse. Today my guest is prolific, I think everybody says that, author, journalist, blogger, activist. I don't know if people still say blogger, but we'll find out. Cory Doctorow, he's the co-founder or co-editor or both of Boing Boing. And the Cory Doctorow shelf on the Drex book, the Drex compound is getting bigger and bigger by the day. We love the young adult novels, Little Brother and Homeland, which we both read together with the Little Drex. But today we're going to be talking about his new book, Radicalized, which has 4, I think on the cover it's tales. Let's grab it here. Since we're in VR, we can grab it. Where is it? That's not it. That's Walk Away. Oh, this is another Cory Doctorow book, which is very important, which just fell down, The Idiot Guide to Writing Sci-Fi. But anyways, Cory, welcome to Virtual Reality.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here virtually.
You are virtually here, and you're also not here because I have you for a little time, and I'm super grateful for that. But you don't really. You're not really a fan of the helmets.
I'm horribly astigmatic, so I get really sick when I wear them, bad headaches and whatnot. I live with a VR professional. My wife is a retired professional gamer who now does a bunch of VR and other alternative storytelling things for Disney through a thing called Studio Lab. So we have all the VR in the house. I just don't use it.
Before we get into Radicalized, and I actually have a hilarious little anecdote. I was just going through customs, flying back from California to Munich, and I'll tell the story later. I had the book in there, and the customs officer was looking at the book, was going like, who is this guy? But in terms of VR, I mean, just, you know, your sense of where we are with especially user-created virtual worlds, since we are in one. Everything here in Sansar is user-created, just like Second Life. Linden Lab is very careful not to say that Sansar is Second Life 2.0, but I do think it is in the sort of philosophical sense of making a space that people can create their own worlds. Do you follow that part of it? Because on Boing Boing, you guys were, reporting a lot on Second Life in the early days and the activism in there and the contentious relationship between the administration and the freewheeling residents.
Yeah, I mean, it continues to be a subject I'm interested in. I mean, mostly as a subset of a bunch of other things I campaign on, like intermediary liability and interoperability and adversarial interoperability, all these kind of long-winded policy things that just boil down to what I call technological self-determination, the right to decide how the technology you depend on works, and if you don't like it, to change it yourself, or to ask someone else to change it for you, either by giving them money or convincing them that it's a good thing to do.
And that is an issue where I am conflicted as a champion of this. We're in the playground of a company, of a profit-driven company, and we could be booted out of here at any point in time. And until we have the open metaverse, I don't think it's paradise. And it's strange that people love the paradigm of Ready Player One or see that as something so desirable. I always find that super strange. I mean, it used to be Snow Crash and now it's Ready Player One, but those are very sort of dystopian scenarios.
Well, as we science fiction writers, I want to say Cyberpunk was a warning, not a suggestion.
Well, the folks in Silicon Valley, I don't think that they should maybe read more sci-fi.
Yeah, satire is dead. But I think that this idea of an open metaverse is a really interesting and cool one, but it doesn't quite. I think that it's that there's like an intermediate step that we could and should advocate for, without wanting to get too deep in the weeds on this. But just the idea that, okay, you've pitched your tent in someone else's server and you're doing some stuff there, and if you get into bad odor with them or they get into bad odor with you and you want to leave, you should at a very minimum be able to take your stuff with you, right? And just export what you've got. And that's been around for a while. I mean, I remember when Stuart Butterfield was starting Flickr, he had a deal where he would let you export your Flickr photos directly into any rival's product, provided that rival would let its customers export their photos into Flickr. So that, you could take your photos anywhere that wasn't a walled garden, and anyone that wasn't a walled garden could take Flickr customers. And that's a great idea. But there's an even more profound kind of interoperability that goes beyond data portability. That is the right to have ongoing data interchanges with services that you no longer use or that you don't use at all. So for example, when Facebook started, it had a really big problem, which was that MySpace had all the people who might be Facebook users. And while Facebook had a better service, a lot of those people preferred being on a social network where their friends were to being on a social network that was well engineered. And this is a difficult conundrum, but the way Facebook resolved it was by giving MySpace users a tool that would log into into MySpace, pretend to be them, get all their waiting messages and put them in their Facebook inbox, let them reply to them from Facebook, and send them back to MySpace. So you could leave MySpace without leaving behind your friends. And if you're embroiled in a virtual world, you should be able to go to a different virtual world, but continue to bridge the gap between you and the people who haven't decided to leave. Otherwise, what you end up with is this huge incumbency bias, where the first service that amasses a large number of users just locks them in. And everyone else shows up because that's where the users are. And those users can't leave because that's where their friends are. And then over time, they can monotonically ratchet up the anti-features that exploit you rather than serving you. So Facebook, and when it launched, billed itself as the private alternative to MySpace. We don't sell your data, right? And so it was only when they attained dominance that they no longer had to look over their shoulder, and they abandon all of the ethical stuff that had once made them attractive.
That brings us really to the core of, and you call it conundrum. I would call it and that's where that's why I brought you on, because I need you to supply us with the magic bullet, because this is built into the economic system that we love so much. I mean, it seems to lead to this monopolization and the willingness to really sort of collaborate. I mean, in context of virtual worlds, it would be avatar compatibility, which is something that everybody wants, and no company right now wants to take the risk, or in other words, the engineering resources, as they call it. I don't know how to get them there, other than frankly, and I hope we're not going to get booted out of Sansa if I say maybe a communist regime of some sorts without the gulag.
I think that you don't have to go that far. So first of all, let's start by acknowledging that markets are all creatures of government, right? Like the apportionment of property rights, the rules about what contracts are and aren't enforceable, and the mechanism by which contracts are enforced, they're all regulatory. So when we talk about fixing markets, we're not talking about taking a thing that exists in nature or that came down off a mountain on 2 stone tablets and then wrapping it in unnatural, modern, newfangled innovations. We're talking about taking a set of rules that were drafted by people and amending the rules to correct the ways in which those go wrong. And, markets historically have led to high degrees of concentration and monopolization. And those monopolizations, they create what Brandeis called the curse of bigness, which is big companies that end up, tripping over themselves, being terrible for the people who work for them, being terrible for the people who rely on them. I mentioned Flickr before. Well, everyone who was around then remembers that Flickr got bought by Yahoo, which spent 20 years buying and murdering every great tech startup in Silicon Valley because, they had a lot of money from SoftBank, but they didn't have any idea what to do with it. And they just destroyed everything great that came out of the internet. And it's kind of a big reason that, the internet today consists of 5 giant websites filled with screenshots from the other 4. So, the thing is that from the Gilded Age till the 1980s, we had really strong antitrust enforcement in the US and through most of the world. And the 3 main rules of antitrust were: you can't merge with a major competitor. You can't buy a nascent competitor. So you can't buy a small company that might someday grow up to challenge you. And you can't own vertical markets. So like if you're a freight company, you can't own a rail line. If you're a bank that loans money to businesses, you can't start a business that competes with your customers. And we abandoned all of those rules under Ronald Reagan. Basically, Reagan hit the campaign trail the same year the Apple II Plus shipped. So big tech grew up with none of those rules. And 40 years later, big tech and all the other industries like eyeglasses and pro wrestling and energy and finance and talent agencies in Hollywood.
And in your book, the toaster business, I was just going to say, the first story, unauthorized bread, which I was thinking like, why not washing machines? I envisioned you sitting there going like, okay, I need a really kind of a ridiculous metaphor. It's not that ridiculous, but maybe for people who don't follow it as closely, you go like, yeah, why would a toaster oven only to use stuff from the same company? It makes sense. They make more money. Did you ever sit there and go like, this should be a washing machine where you can only wash clothes that you buy from the same manufacturer? Were you sitting? Are there drafts, Corey, that you will release later on I don't know, eBay or something?
The origin of the story, which is about refugee housing, where you have to use landlord-approved consumables. So like the landlord-approved bread in your toaster, the landlord-approved clothes in your washing machine, the landlord-approved dishes in your dishwasher, is that back when Apple first started selling devices that would only run software that Apple had blessed and that Apple had taken 30% of the purchase price for, there were a lot of people who defended that practice as like absolutely essential because how else could they protect your safety and maintain quality and so on. These arguments struck me as like monumentally unconvincing. And it struck me that you could make every one of those arguments about dishwashers. Foodborne illness has killed more people than any other cause in the history of the human race. And so I wrote a column for The Guardian where I was writing at the time called if iPhones were dishwashers. And it took the form of a letter from a Steve Jobs figure to his customers and stakeholders explaining why it was unreasonable of them to want to be able to wash grandma's china in their dishwasher, and how he couldn't guarantee that they wouldn't die of cholera if they insisted on using their own dishes in their dishwasher. Plus, by restricting the dishwasher to authorized dishes, he could create a new market for innovative new dish solutions. And how would those people get paid if you could just install a pirate dish? And so this was all, at the time I was like, okay, well, this is my little, bit of satire and everyone will get the joke. And predictably enough, because Mac users tend to think of themselves as an oppressed religious minority.
Not all of them.
Well, I mean, speaking as someone who has an Apple tattooed on his arm, I have a Mac tattooed on my right arm and used to administer multi-million-dollar Apple networks. There is a strong thread, and I don't use the term lightly, religious fervor in Mac ownership.
You're speaking as a reformed Appleite then.
Yeah, and there are a lot of people, I can tell you from that column, there were a lot of people for whom it was just like, well, that's outrageous. I mean, yes, it's completely reasonable for the person who sells you your phone to insist that you arrange your affairs to benefit their shareholders, but no one would ever do this with dishwashers. And of course, here we are, and there are so many IoT devices that have exactly this mechanism. So, Nerf just released a Nerf gun that uses digital rights management to stop you from loading third-party foam darts. And there's a company called Abbott Labs that makes a continuous glucose monitor that people with diabetes modify so they can connect it to an insulin pump and create an artificial pancreas. And they just used the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that bans breaking DRM to shut down this project, arguing basically that your internal organs become copyrighted works that they own the copyright to as soon as you augment them with one of their devices.
The interesting thing I want to interject here, because now as you're telling the story, and I was thinking, like, how can I not spoil some of this stuff? So if I start spoiling it and you don't want that, just tell me to stop. Because this story in the four, this is the first one in the book, Unauthorized Bread, I found that actually most hopeful. My sense was you're going increasingly darker. Now, as you're sort of recollecting the origin of the story, it sounds super bleak. But in the actual story, there are rays of hope. I mean, there is a refugee who has an ally in the tech world, people who work for big tech, but who have sort of retained their moral integrity, and that to me is sort of the ray of hope. But as you move on through the stories, it gets pretty dark. So just a quick general question: do you is that your sense, or what should readers take away of this? Is that intentional, or did the editor sort of put it in that sequence?
Yeah, you know what? I think that in answering this, I can close the loop with what I was talking about before with adversarial interoperability, because we have an undue focus both in our lives and in the fiction that we write about technology on the features and anti-features of technology. What does it do and what doesn't it do? But what's way more important than that is who it does it for and who it does it to. And the difference between a utopia and a dystopia is not which technologies there are, it's whose finger is on the button. And Unauthorized Bread is a story about seizing the means of computation, right? About becoming a technologically self-deterministic, being able to decide to use your stuff to benefit you, and to do so with the collaboration and solidarity of your neighbors and other stakeholders in it. And so all of these stories, to the extent that they have a thread that runs through them, it's the thread that runs through my work, which is, there's a great legal paper that was published by Public Knowledge on 3D printing and copyright and patents by this guy, Michael Weinberg. And the title is, "This Will All Be So Great If We Don't Screw It Up." And, if I have like a guiding philosophy about technology, it's that. It's that the reason to care about technology is not just that it's scary to imagine what will happen if we get it wrong, but it's really exciting to imagine what happens when we get it right. And, the four stories in this book all touch on this in one way or another. So there's the story Model Minority, which is about Superman intervening in the fatal beating of...
Oh, you gave it away.
It's in the first page. Intervening in the fatal beating by the NYPD of someone who's a lightly fictionalized version of Eric Garner, the man who was choked to death on a city street by an NYPD officer for selling loose cigarettes that were untaxed, and who, his death was recorded by a friend of his who was then imprisoned and I believe murdered in prison as well. And the cop who did it walked away. And this is a story about Superman and the theory, which is very common in tech circles, that the solution to big systemic problems is individual action, right? It's the Schindler's List theory that, if one person is brave enough to stand up, that we can change things. And, Superman was actually created by a couple of Jewish kids in New York, one of them from Toronto, where I'm from. My parents used to live on Joe Shuster Way, named for one of the Superman creators, who observed Nazism on the rise across the Atlantic and conceived of a golem, right? Like an unstoppable, pluripotent, artificial creation that would go and interpose itself between Nazism and the world. And, we didn't defeat Nazism by one person being brave, right? We defeated Nazism with the largest collective action measure in history. And so, today we are often, when we think about racism, we want to individualize it. We want to say, oh, well, that discriminatory conduct can be excused because the person who did it is not a racist. And it ignores the systemic nature of it. Now, if there's one thing computers are really good at, it's mounting systemic responses to systemic problems, right? To build movements. The movement for Black Lives, for example, wouldn't exist without the internet because it was the power of the internet to unify people across time and space that made it so effective.
You sound so optimistic now, but in Model Minority, it's also about predictive policing. So the computers build, yes, they're very good at building these structures, but then again, like you said, if the power structure is not fundamentally changed, then this technology will not suit the people who it should be for. And I mean, I'm not asking you to I was joking, like, please prescribe our conduct, holy Corey. I don't know. I guess that's always what science fiction writers are being asked. I discussed this when Carl Schroeder was here, who creates these scenarios. But still, I mean, the model minority is fairly bleak. And me as an immigrant to America, what I read into the story also, I mean, it's right there, is that Superman, he dedicates his entire life to public service, if you will.
I think that, that was particularly a reflection of my own experience as the child of a Jewish refugee. So when my father got to Canada, he was racialized. He was thought of as a racial minority. He was subjected to anti-Semitic violence and harassment. But Jews became white, right? Whiteness is totally contingent. Jews have today, in large part, thrown their lot in with white supremacy. You have people like Stephen Miller, who's a white supremacist, in the White House. There's the unification of the Islamophobic white nationalist movement and the Jewish right wing has been ghastly for me to watch as, the child of a Jewish refugee. And I think that they overestimate the durability of their whiteness, right? The thing that I think a lot of people who are of Jewish extraction who supported Trump got a wake-up call with was the day that Charlottesville was filled with Trump supporters chanting, "Jews will not replace us," and Sieg Heiling. And if you're the last person in the whiteness boat, you're the first person they toss over the gunnels.
That is such an important point as we live in a day and age where Eli Valley, a wonderful cartoonist, is being trolled by a group that calls itself StopAntisemitism.org and putting a wedge between, Jews abroad and then the real Jews who are not sort of, who are basically non-Zionist. I mean,
I think that if Jews mean never again, if never again is more than a slogan, then Jews have to be on the side of all struggles against racial oppression and against white nationalism and against particularly the eugenic theory that accompanies the racism against Black and brown people, people of Middle Eastern extraction, people of Central and South American extraction, and so on, that those same eugenic theories that are, grounded in junk science are what were used to justify the extermination of 6 million Jews. And if you are not on the right side of the resurgence in those toxic ideologies, then you have learned nothing from the death of the 6 million, and their lives were squandered. And so, in part, this is a story about the contingency of whiteness. We have a complex story about the causal relationship of hateful ideology or hateful tropes like concentration camp jokes and racist violence or a rise in racist ideas, right? So, and the question is, do people find racist jokes funny because they're racist, or do people become racist because they find racist jokes funny? And it's probably a little of both. But for me, and you're kind of obliquely referencing the third story, the title story, which is Radicalized, which is about angry, respectable middle class white dudes whose loved ones are sentenced to slow, painful deaths by healthcare insurers who refuse to cover treatments that would otherwise bring them back from fatal illnesses, who end up on message boards that are nominally support boards for people going through this, but are actually radicalization forums in which people are turned into suicide bombers who kill healthcare executives. And for me, the radicalization story is unduly focused on the things that people who have been radicalized believe, and insufficiently focused on what are the conditions that make people prone to believing these outlandish explanations, things like eugenics and demographic replacement theories and so on. And I think that what we're living through right now, more than a breakdown in our consensus about what's true, is a breakdown in our consensus in how we know whether a thing is true or not. And specifically, it's a breakdown in whether we can trust official processes that determine truth, right? Like whether the FDA can be trusted when it tells you a foodstuff is safe, or whether the FAA can be trusted when it tells you an airplane is safe, and so on. And when you scratch conspiracy theorists, you find people who know an awful lot about real conspiracies, right? So when you ask someone who believes in anti-vax why they believe in anti-vax, they can often tell you an awful lot about how the medical safety process was subverted by a family of super rich people who suborned their regulators and got opioids, the use of opioids approved and expanded, right? And that's the Sackler family, who are now richer than the Rockefellers, and whose actions led to the death of more than 200,000 Americans, more people than died in Vietnam, more Americans than died in Vietnam. And, the people who believe in that levees were dynamited in New Orleans during the Hurricane Katrina to drown the black neighborhoods so that the white neighborhoods would be spared. This is a very widespread belief among some African Americans. And the thing is that they know, the people who believe this, know an awful lot about how in 1958, in Tupelo, Mississippi, they did dynamite the levees in order to drown the black neighborhoods so that the white neighborhoods would be spared. That a rise in conspiratorial thinking, I think, is much more closely related to a rise in conspiracies than it is to a rise in the persuasiveness of conspiracy theorists.
Right.
I've been hearing people talk about, you can go and you can read anti-vax stuff dating back to the Salk vaccine, and the arguments didn't get better. Right? So what is it that changed about our material conditions that made the same stupid arguments more salient between the Salk vaccine and now? And I think what it is a breakdown in our trust in our institutions. And that lack of trust in our institutions is mostly because our industries have become so concentrated, getting back to where we started, that regulators are increasingly beholden to the industries they're supposed to regulate. And the processes are suborned by the industries, that the truth is for sale.
That would explain why, especially anti-vaxxer conspiracy theories and others are so prevalent in sort of fairly privileged circles.
The thing is that being well educated does not mean that you shouldn't or don't believe in conspiracies. Being well educated might actually expose you to more information about real conspiracies, right? And people who believe in UFOs are chapter and verse on aerospace industry cover-ups. There have been a lot of aerospace industry cover-ups. I don't think they covered up Area 51, but I do think that there's an awful lot of, log rolling and pork barrel politics where things that didn't work and were dangerous and were overpriced were, sold to government officials by aerospace personnel who, knew that they would have a friend there because they were going to offer those people a better job when they finish their government service. And so I don't think it's unreasonable to believe in that, when you put it that way.
But the radicalized thing is more, you radicalize, me. I'm not going to go out and bomb insurance companies, but there's a very sympathetic cause here, to be quite honest. And I was wondering, were you concerned, or did your wife or somebody who you are in close communication, were they worried that you would be accused of advocating violence?
It's come up, and the story clearly doesn't advocate violence, but what it does do is it really tries to reckon with the incontrovertible truth that rights are never given, they're always taken, and that every justice struggle involves some activity that crosses the line, and that the truth and reconciliation phase after a justice struggle needs to look that stuff in the eye, right? And really understand it. The Allies during World War II, some of the things that they did with the prisoners they captured were unjust, or the bombing, the bombing of not Bremen. What city was Slaughterhouse?
Dresden.
Of Dresden. Yeah, the firebombing of Dresden, or the Hiroshima, and certainly the Nagasaki bombs. These were not just actions, and they can't entirely be hand waved away by the fog of war. They were in many cases calculated injustice, done in the full knowledge that it was wrong. In the same way that the Irish struggle for self-determination also involved deplorable and inexcusable attacks on civilians. And, figuring out what you do with the people who you knew were bastards, but you gave them a pass because they were your bastards when things looked like an existential crisis, after that crisis has passed, that is a hard problem that nobody has a great answer for.
And again, this is fantastic that you're going on into this territory, and you're brave enough to put something out there in literary form where you don't have an answer, and you put it like that, and you really trigger the thought process here, and thank you for it. And like I said, I was pulled up by customs, and they actually did detect a MacBook Air that I bought in Palm Springs, and I didn't really think about it. I didn't, whatever. I'm admitting to a crime here on a stream, but the guy was looking at the radicalized book. He, taking the stuff out of my backpack, and he really,
Right.
he gave me that look. Go like, this dude. What's up with this dude reading a book like that? And people behind.
That's funny. I thought you were going to say they took your laptop away and put the Bundestrojaner on it.
I'll tell you, this is a whole different conversation. I'm not going to get off track here, but it was infuriating, and I took the opportunity to tell them, I'm a big fan of public services, but what you guys are doing, wasting, my tax dollars or euros, I like to pay taxes, but what you guys are doing here is ridiculous. You're wasting a lot of time. But anyways, I was saying, like, he looked at the book, and I thought he was thinking like this, the dragster is dangerous. The last story is Mask of Red Death, and just very briefly, what I read into this is sort of, this is a social collapse story where a rich guy builds a compound for his folks and wants to ride out the apocalypse, and then get in on the ground floor of disaster capitalism and rebuild it. And that, to me, is, in a nutshell, the issue of economists, or not economists, but people who get very rich in this economic system, and then being so delusional that they believe they know how society works, and they don't. And but that goes to the topic of to beginning of our conversation, where I don't know how to reverse that trend. I mean, I do contract work for Linden Lab, and Linden Lab had people from social sciences on staff to really sort of think about, what populations in virtual worlds would do. They don't have those anymore. It's,
So, yeah, it's a story about rich preppers shitting themselves to deaths of cholera in a bunker while people better than them get the sanitation working in the city after things go wrong. And, it is not pessimistic to imagine that complex systems will break down. The second law of thermodynamics is like, it's not just a good idea, it's the law. And, engineers who design things on the assumption that they just won't go wrong don't make good things. They make the Titanic, right? They just like, oh, we don't need lifeboats. The Titanic is unsinkable. And so I don't think that it's a dystopia to imagine that things might go wrong. What is dystopian is to imagine.
No, if the undoing is imminent, I think that's the main reason, because sort of delusional economists and engineers are running societies.
Yeah, and what is dystopian is to imagine that, we can't get things running again when they break down. And, that's kind of the difference between a utopia and a dystopia is what happens after the machine stops. Does it, explode and shower you with white hot shrapnel, or does it coast to a gentle stop and then we all get together behind it and push it back into movement? And so, to get back to your question, how do we change people's perception? Well, the idea that selfishness is the cardinal virtue and that we all share, it's although it's or that and that we all share this belief and that it produces like Pareto optimal outcomes and so on. Although it's been official doctrine forever, even the most avaricious stockbroker will shout at their toddler in the playground and say, "Now share that with that other kid." So we know deep in our heart that mutual aid is the true foundation of civilizational progress.
Your word and Ayn Rand's ear. Yeah.
Yeah, and the way that we build, well, speaking of Ayn Rand, right? Here's this woman who like worships architects. The way that we built cathedrals that lasted for, that took generations to build, was not with every man for himself. It was with a sense of a higher duty and purpose that was motivated by a communal solidarity. And solidaristic ideas are on the upswing. Not least because, especially as we become more polarized and more unequal, the people with less and less have to rely on each other more and more because there's our society is no longer picking up the slack. We're no longer getting the kinds of services that characterized the 30 glorious years after the war when we built the welfare state. And so, I think that solidarity is on the rise, and I think that telling stories about the value of solidarity can only help that.
Thank you, Corey. I have one last question, but thank you for actually convincing me now that this super suspenseful and page turner is not as depressing as I thought or as I made it out to be. It is ultimately actually quite energizing, I guess, by holding up the mirror with these various people. We didn't even talk about Batman, the philanthropist, which was awesome, I thought, too. The very last question, I have actually two here, but I'm going to pick one. I wanted to ask you, how do you get kids to find a love for reading and keep that love in a time of audiovisual overwhelming offerings? Your wife working for Disney, the streaming wars are imminent, but Jerry Spinelli, great author, is coming also to Sansar, so I'm going all over the place. Do you often have, last question, do you often have contentious or interesting energizing debates with your wife, who works for a behemoth, and you are this independent author and activist, and she works for the man?
I used to work for Disney. I used to work for Disney too. I worked for Imagineering. So it's.
Then convince me that Disney is not the man.
Oh, no, Disney's totally the man. But here's the thing. Science fiction's job is to take things that is to take things that are in the world and imagine them with a different economic and social context, right? What if Walmart was a worker-owned collective? And so, I did this with Disney, right? My first novel, Down and Out the Magic Kingdom, basically reimagines Disney theme parks as worker-owned collectives. For me, it's easy to love the sin and hate the sinner, right? To be completely bullish on data processing as a praxis that the human race benefits from without excusing IBM's tabulations at Auschwitz. I think Disney makes good art, not all of it, but I think a lot of it
Pete's Dragon, 1977. Oh my God.
The Haunted Mansion, right? That's my thing, right? But that they make good art, and that they also have bad policy prescriptions and also bad actions in the market. And for me, in the same way that I can respect that people enjoy being connected to their friends through Facebook, but deplore the economic and technological structures that Facebook uses to trap them, I can also be completely supportive of the good art that Disney makes without excusing the elements of it that I find inexcusable, like some of their lobbying activities, some of their commercial activities, some of their labor practices. It's possible to celebrate what is good, and without letting what's bad off the hook. And then the logical thing that you do after that is try to imagine how to upregulate the good stuff and downregulate the bad stuff, right? To reimagine those institutions.
Fantastic. And keep pushing, because change comes from comes from the bottom. Keep pushing collectively and action and all that good stuff. Corey, this was awesome. Thank you so much. And maybe some of these, maybe when the goggles get implanted into you.
Yeah, I'm not getting a medical implant, but okay.
Why not? Don't you have an Apple tattoo? Come on, this is the next step.
Yeah. I was 18 when I got that.
I have a Pegasus tattoo when I was 18. The freedom. Yeah.
My Little Pony.
I'm gonna go back to Second Life and play Bronies. That's it. Drexter out.
All right. Lovely to talk with you.